Well, thank you so much to the Education Alliance for having me on today. I want to first thank First Lady Kathy Justice, not only for your introduction today, but for being just such a catalyst for change and your leadership to allow CIS to grow and to flourish in West Virginia has been second to none. And I want to again show my gratitude. Thank you to our state superintendent, Clayton Birch, who's going to be following just after I get the opportunity to speak with you. I also want to extend my gratitude to Michelle Blatt, who is the deputy superintendent, and really the entire team at the West Virginia Department of Education for their leadership, their creativity, and the oversight of our work in your beautiful state. Again, to the Education Alliance, your organization's mission models really the spirit of what Communities in Schools has believed in for over 40 years, which is that the partnership of business, public sector, and community leaders is what's needed to create sustained change for our communities, but also for our students within education. And I cannot go any further without just applauding, shouting out, and with exclamation points at the very end, the work of Erin Boyd. Miss Boyd is one of our site coordinators. And when folks ask, what is it about CIS? What's the innovation? What's the secret sauce? What's the magic formula for an organization that's been around for 40 years, using evidence to truly ensure that students stay in school, but also graduate from high school. And it is the Erin Boyds of the world. And I want to say thank you to Erin for your work. The work of a site coordinator, like the work of our teachers and our educators, really is a calling. So I want to say how grateful we are to the site coordinators who are working in West Virginia schools, but maybe on the call here today. Well, again, my name is Ray Saldana, and among the many things that I am proud of in my life, I'm a proud first-generation American. My father immigrated to this country, and I'm also the first in my family, as the First Lady mentioned, to graduate from college. But now I get to call myself the first alumnus, a product of the program of Communities in Schools, just like the student that Miss Boyd was caring for, a product of Communities in Schools that is now, I'm now able to call myself the president and CEO of the national organization. And just to back up a little bit, because I know that the First Lady mentioned this, she outed me, I'm a former elected official in San Antonio, which means that I'm a recovering politician. And I think that first things first is a funny thing about politics that somebody once told me. They said, do you know the origins of the word politics? And I said, no, I guess I don't really. And they said, it comes from the Latin term poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. And I tell you that because they said that even while I was still in office a few years ago. But there is so much that I learned from the experience of actually knocking on people's doors, getting to know them and their families and their life stories, just like our site coordinator described to you today. In fact, I remember the first time I ran for office, which was when I was 24, and I was knocking on doors, and folks didn't know whether I was running for the city council or running for the student council at the time. But it was that experience and 3,000 doors later that just really explained to me the power and the magic of an organization like Communities in Schools, which is that at the end of the day, everything is local, whether it is community to community, student to teacher, or in our case, site coordinator to our students. And so let's go ahead and jump into the next slide, because I want to talk to you about our community. So at Communities in Schools, again, we've been around for 43 years now. Today, our reach is that we are serving in over 26 states, or in 26 states and the District of Columbia, reaching 1.6 million students all across the country. And as you can see on the map, there is a star over West Virginia, because the strategy is a little unique here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. But we directly support the Department of Education in order to ensure that site coordinators are placed in schools across the state to deliver our evidence-based model. In other communities that we serve, specifically where I'm calling you from here today in San Antonio, Texas, we operate as a 501c3 invited into the schools. But in West Virginia, our site coordinators are trained to do the work that we do all across the country, but to do so in your community, county to county. And I just want to, if I can, focus in, and we'll go to the next slide and zoom in to West Virginia specific storyline here. You see, CIS, Communities in Schools, has a history of working in West Virginia that traces back to really the founding of CIS of Greenbrier in 2003. So one community serving a handful of schools in Greenbrier. Since 2003, what the magic and the pivot and the moment that I want to take you to is in 2017. That is when the work caught the attention and the support of First Lady Kathy Justice, who led an effort to bring communities and schools to more counties around West Virginia. And it was under her and the governor's leadership that the seeds of statewide community schools was planted. And in 2018, CIS was added to 3 counties representing 9 total schools under the West Virginia Department of Education effort. And just last year, in 2019, the West Virginia Department of Education expanded funding to reach 67 schools in 14 counties. Furthermore, as more school district leaders, business leaders, and community leaders learned about our work, learned about the work of CIS, even, and this is important, even in a challenging and difficult year like the summer that we've gone through, site coordinators today are now serving 116 schools in 23 counties. So that in the coming year, we estimate that 2,800 students will receive individualized support, just like the support that Erin Boyd described in her experience, and serving upwards of 43,000 West Virginia students who will benefit from CIS site coordinators integrating with community supports. I want to pause because I want to just emphasize this momentum, something that is unprecedented in our organization. But in just 3 years, the state of West Virginia and the counties throughout it expanded from 3 counties in 9 schools to 116 schools, reaching over 47,000 students. I want to just say that this work, catalyzed by the First Lady, but the growth really being sustained by the Department of Education and local communities and foundations around the state, are really getting to see what we hope will be the value of this work. But because the theme of this venue that we're part of today is to be connected, I want to just say up front that I talk about West Virginia in just about all the meetings that I have with state leaders, with foundation partners, with policymakers who want to understand about the most exciting work that is happening in our network. You see, the partnership with West Virginia will have ripples all across the country, and here is why I believe that. I said at the outset that we serve 1.6 million students across the country. But today, if you track statistics and the demographics of our school, the number of students who are dealing with challenges, who are living in poverty, is closer to 14 million students all across the country. And another statistic that I want you to think about is that back in 1980, we took a snapshot of students who were living in poverty. In 1980, that was 30% of students who were sitting in public schools, who were dealing and living and coping with the effects of poverty. In 2016, that number jumped from 30% to 51% of the students sitting in our public schools who are grappling with poverty. And what that means now is that the majority of the students in our public schools all across the country need the kinds of supports that are not yet built into the schools, which is essentially the work of communities and schools and site coordinators training caring adults to be in the schools side by side, doing an evaluation and assessment to find the students who really need our help. And so when I think about the work rippling across state lines at West Virginia, it will mean that folks will want to know, how is it that West Virginia in 3 years grew from just 3 schools to 106 schools? I got to say that as we think about the future of our country and the future of public education system, it will hopefully look more and more like what is being built at West Virginia. But because I have the opportunity, I want to make sure for those folks who are new to the work of CIS, let's talk a little bit of time describing what it is that we do. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as Erin described, our founder, Bill Milliken, believed something at his core that we still believe today within the organization, which is that programs don't change children, relationships do. In communities and schools, we built on that premise that relationships are at the core of what we do, that communities and schools, the theory of change links the activities and the practices of our organization to the intended future outcomes. Now, I want to pull back a little bit because as an alumna of the program, I will say that when I met CIS, I didn't realize I was meeting a national organization. I didn't realize that the person who was my errand boy, her name was Mrs. Bell. I didn't know that Mrs. Bell was trained to be in my school to find students like me and to intervene, to not only, as Ms. Boyd described, praise us when we're doing well, but also get upset at us when things were not going well, when we didn't show up, when we needed just an extra hand. That is the magic of communities and schools. That is the future of public education when we have folks like Mrs. Bell, who was part of my life, or Mrs. Boyd, who was part of the life of the student she described, is actually working in the schools to find the students that we work with to ensure that they are on a path not just to attend school and observe behavioral outcomes, but also graduate and keep an ongoing relationship so that the theory of change, the diagram that's captured here, and the intended outcomes of our work on the right-hand side, that we're confident that our work helps students to improve their attendance. We impact behavior and coursework. We can increase graduation rates when we're working in schools and also reduce dropout rates. All that really, we hope, leads to college and career readiness, civic engagement, but really what we want for all of our students, what we want for all of our children, which is a successful life. And behind every successful student is a relationship with a caring adult. If it is not a family member, if it's not a parent, if it's not a grandparent, we hope that it is with a site coordinator that is present in their school. Let's go to the next slide. And it's really just our evidence-based and our impact, but I want you to focus in on the bottom right-hand corner, because we're talking a lot about social emotional learning and how there is a gap in the way that we are showing up for students in schools. Well, our site coordinators work in support of students to promote healthy social emotional competencies because it's the foundation to being able to learn. Last spring, before school closures went into effect in West Virginia, 81% of case managed students with academic goals maintained or improved their goals in academics. Because as our site coordinators know, that there are so many non-academic factors in the life of our students today that if you do not address food insecurity, that if you do not address homelessness, the fact that some of our students are dealing with crisis and trauma at the home, they are not going to be able to walk through the doors of the schoolhouse prepared to learn. I want to give you just a quick example, a story that we use as an example from West Virginia. You know, we talk about the model and the data, but I want to make this real for many of you. In Cabell County, West Virginia, we asked one of our local site coordinators to share an experience of one of our students. Of course, she mentioned that there were many students in her caseload, and many suffered with things that I know we've talked a little bit about in the previous sessions here around social emotional needs, but the things that surface when we ask our site coordinators about the problems, the barriers, the concerns in the lives of our students, they're issues like incarcerated parents, perhaps they're living on their own, they're dealing with drugs within the home or raising young siblings. But she told us about one student, a student who I'm going to refer to as Emma. Emma was talking to a friend in class and a teacher overheard some of the conversation about a fight with her mom the night before. She was living in a home with a verbally and physically abusive mother who was dealing with her own stresses as a young mother. And knowing that this student may have needed someone to check in with her, her teacher made a referral to a CIS site coordinator. Emma was a sophomore at the time, and she was struggling to find who she really wanted to be, living at home in a stressful and abusive environment. So to our site coordinator, Emma was one who was full of potential, but shouldered a lot of stress on her own. At times, it manifested itself in challenges respecting people in power. And so our site coordinator and Emma worked quite a bit on just self-awareness and who was she and who did she want to become. They needed to set goals, and most people start with small goals, and her site coordinator believed the opposite. She said, let's see the big goal and work on coming up with a plan of small goals to reach that one big one. That is exactly what they did. Her big goal was to graduate high school, but not only graduate, but become the first in her family to graduate from high school. So after Emma was dealing with self-awareness, it was self-management that was next. And so we have now a goal that our site coordinator was working with Emma on, and she had several classes that needed to be recovered from her freshman year. And they had placed her on guided practice, how many classes she needed to complete, what percentage she needed to be on by the end of each 9 weeks. And she achieved them all with the support of her psych coordinator every step of the way. And she has this to say. Recently, during quarantine, she said she brought Tudor's biscuits and sweet tea every Saturday for breakfast for the two of them. She knew that she would always show up and that the trust was there to stay. And she mentioned, I showed up and she rarely had someone show up for her. And look, this is oftentimes the science and the evaluation. There is oftentimes science and evaluation that is attached to the work that our psych coordinators do and work on. In fact, it's some of the work that I believe Ms. Cantor is going to describe in the science of working with students who are recovering from trauma. But sometimes it can only really be described as love and the calling of our adults and our educators to work with our young students. And just quickly, I want to focus on, if we'll go to the next slide here, how all of that now is more important than ever. We haven't seen the full impacts of the pandemic, which are part of every aspect of our daily lives today. But there is the obvious. There is the extreme pressure on our healthcare system, its ability to help care for the most vulnerable Americans, the economic challenges for individuals, communities, business sectors, public agencies, and the nation as a whole. The social grief, the trauma that students are going to be dealing with, the disconnectedness, the canceled celebrations that happened at the end of the last school year, these are all dramatic changes in the routines that reflect a lack of certainty about the future for our students. And what can't be overlooked, and I want to state this, is the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on families living in poverty and of communities of color. In the midst of the pandemic, we've had public demonstrations for racial justice and equity call upon all institutions to reflect on how issues of classism and racism and poverty work together to erect barriers to success and things that we believe need us calling for systems change. If we'll go to the next slide. So now that schools have been closed and we're slowly opening them back up, we not only, I think, lost the physical space for learning, we lost the social space and the engagement space, the space for many community and supports where CIS has shown up. In fact, as an organization called Communities in Schools, we've now been working on what it's like to work beyond school walls. And I want to just go to the next slide here because it speaks to how psych coordinators in West Virginia have really shown up. In the wake of disruption and uncertainty, CIS was there. CIS psych coordinators in West Virginia were doing everything they could to respond to the needs, not only with food deliveries, but as Ms. Boyd described, house visits, porch visits. We became communities, not just in schools, but communities in front porches, helping to set up students with virtual counseling, new ways to reach students and families. All of these moments really teaching us new ways to adapt to the future. And let me close up here just with a final component, which is next slide here. What is now required of us? We believe that communities must come together, collectively build systems of support for those of the most vulnerable who are impacted. Schools need to be supported by communities to meet those academic, social, and emotional needs of the whole child. And moreover, communities and schools, even West Virginia, they're showing up every day so they can come together and help students succeed. It's why the Education Alliance exists, to ensure that we are connecting the dots. And at our best, if we'll go to the